During the week of Thanksgiving, Laura and I had an opportunity to accompany the Dr. Phillips High School Band to Chicago for their marching in the Thanksgiving Day Parade, and you have to keep high school kids busy, so we did a lot of stuff in Chicago, including visiting the Museum of Science and Industry. Now, as we came into what I think is the group entrance to the Museum of Science and Industry, and I did zero research on the place, I didn't know what we were going to see, but in that entrance was all of the space stuff. And so the signs pointed to the capsule that was there, and there were signs that pointed to the submarine. Now, I didn't set any active expectations in my mind about what a submarine inside a museum might look like, but my unconscious, I later figured out, started to set an expectation that it wouldn't be that big. It would be this small submarine that was captured. And as we walked along and looked at all the space stuff, I just kept thinking, we got to go see the submarine. And when you get close to it, there's all kinds of videos and big banners you can read and little signs that tell you the story of how we captured this German U-boat during World War II. There's even videos that show the thing coming up out of the water and how big the top of it is. And amidst all of that, my brain was still setting an expectation that this thing wasn't that big. So we worked our way along, and you come down a hall, and you turn, and there's the submarine. And the first thing that happened was I stopped dead in my tracks and just said, whoa, because it is a full-on gigantic submarine in the basement of this building. And as I was standing there just gawking at the size of it, because you're at the front of it, you can just see the full length of it, and it's huge. A whole bunch of little kids came up behind me and turned the corner, and they went, whoa, like a whole bunch of them all together. And I think they experienced what I experienced, which was we had some level of expectation that we were going to see a submarine, but we had no idea how magnificent it was going to be to turn the corner and see just how big it was. Expectation is part of what we talk about in Advent. And I have to say that for probably about the last 4 or 5 years, Advent has become perhaps my favorite season of the church year. And it all started quite a few years ago when one of the people I was in conversation with as we were planning Advent said, you know, we do Advent every year, but we haven't done it yet this year. So what is going to be new about Advent for us this year? And as we wrestled with that, we said, well, what's Advent about then? And the question that came up was, well, isn't it about looking for Jesus and expecting Jesus to show up? And then we said, well, where do we expect Jesus to show up? And if you are honest about that question of where you need Jesus and want Jesus to show up, that can get to some pretty dark places pretty fast. Now, we don't want Advent to be dark, right? We want it to be like pre-Christmas. And so I get a lot of people pushing back saying, well, this sounds a little sad and somber. But that is where Advent has landed for me, is in this place of knowing that there's this brokenness amongst us, right? We're between the good at the beginning and the good at the end. And when we're in this in-between place, there's that tension between how things sometimes aren't where we want them to be and the hope of what we hope they will be, especially as people of faith, as we see that articulated in Scripture and the promises Jesus has for us. So the question that I come to every year is, where do we expect Jesus to show up? But this year then I'm wondering, what is it really we're expecting? And when you talk about what we're expecting, it's easy in Advent to think about Christmas and think, well, we're expecting the baby Jesus and that nice tender story. But that's not the story we start with in the first Sunday of Advent out of the Gospel of Mark. We start with a story that comes close to the end. And it's not a nice warm story of a baby. It's the part where Jesus is talking about what's going to happen. And if we had backed up a little bit, we would have heard him talk about the temple being torn down and pain and suffering and death and destruction. So that when we pick it up today, the first thing we hear is, and after all of that suffering, so after all that terrible stuff, the sun is going to go dark. Does that sound good? No. The moon is going to lose its light, the stars are going to fall, and all of this sounds terribly ominous. And then you get the little bit about the fig tree, like being the sign when it starts to sprout. And then he says, so pay attention. This generation will not pass away before all these things happen. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So that all is kind of, you're starting to wonder, when is this going to happen? And what does all this look like? And then you get to the bit where he says, you know, when the master leaves and comes back, you got to pay attention, right? You got to be alert, because you never know when they're coming back. Does that sound a little ominous in that one as well? Right? It's I thought about it earlier. When I was a kid, my parents would leave, and we never knew how long they were going to be gone. So all of the things we were doing or we should have been doing, you had to kind of hope you got it done before they got back, right? That's the kind of alertness you get a sense for in this story. And so when you take all of this together and say, as we gather on Advent and we're expecting Jesus, are we expecting that to be a good thing or a bad thing? And sometimes we live in that space of hope, but I've had many conversations with people who don't expect it to be necessarily good. One year we were in an Advent dinner, and a group of people pulled me aside, and I think it was the year that somebody predicted the world was going to end on December 22nd or something like that. And so they said, Pastor, what do you think of all this? And the question had a little bit of a tone to it, like, is the end really near? Do we need to be worried? Right? Because the underlying thing is some are going to get taken and some are left behind is the way we think about this. I have other conversations in Bible study where somebody suggested we all should be afraid because Jesus is coming back to smite us. Now, I don't talk to you all and mostly hear that, but I do think we have a sense amongst us generally that we have to do good, and we look at people that aren't doing good and wonder if they're going to make it. And when you have that kind of mindset, it's very easy to hear this story about Jesus talking about the future and this coming and this gathering and this terrible stuff and think it's not going to go well. And so we can land in this place of expectation that doesn't leave us with the hope that you would hope we would have when we talk about Advent and waiting and expectation. As a Bible study on Wednesday night, we've been reading the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation, if you read it one particular way, sounds terrible and frightening. There's all these visions of war and disasters being unleashed on the earth. And some people read that and say, that's what's coming. And if that's what's coming, then you behave a certain way. Not always the best, because you're trying to make sure you get yours and take care of yourself so that when that shows up, you're taken care of. But our whole reading of Revelation in these past several weeks have been digging into it, has been a whole different understanding. Because Revelation was written to a very particular group of people. They were refugees from a war. They were Jewish Christians that kind of went around the ocean a little bit there, or the sea. And when they showed up, they were poor, and they weren't going to worship the emperor because they were worshiping Jesus, and so they were considered unpatriotic by their neighbors. So they were at least living in poverty and dislike of their neighbors. There were times, though, that they could expect much worse persecution from the emperor, right? And so written into that is this book of Revelation that isn't necessarily this future-looking thing so much as an acknowledgement of the terrible situation they live in, and then a statement that said it's not always going to be that way because God can make all things new. And when you read Revelation that way, it's a whole different book. Yes, there's these crazy images and all of this violence, but it's all violence that they lived with every day. So when you think about like fires and earthquakes and storms, did they have those in their day? Sure they did. And did they have violence? Well, of course they did. They lived under the occupation of the Roman Empire. So when you read all of that and understand it in the present tense, you say, oh, this is what it's like already. And then comes the promises of hope. So it's that kind of framework that I then came to this story from Mark. We can look at it and say, yes, this is a far-off prediction, and we should be looking up at the clouds every day just to check and make sure it's not the day that Jesus comes riding in on the clouds. If it's a clear day, maybe we're like, okay, clear day, don't have to worry today. But what if Jesus isn't necessarily talking about some far-off future, but he's talking about today? What if that's what he's saying? There's, if we read the early bits of it and said, there's all this terrible stuff that's going to happen. We have earthquakes and terrible fires that destroy things and hurricanes and all kinds of disasters that are super destructive in people's lives today. We do, right? And there are people that pay attention to that and then say, uh-oh, Jesus must be coming because here's the signs. Do we have violence and war? Do we have plenty of suffering and pain? Yes. So when Jesus says this generation will not pass away before all these things happen, we can look at the bad stuff of that, forgetting about the sun falling out of the sky and all the rest of that. We can look at the bad stuff of that, and do we experience that all right now? We absolutely do. So in that way, what Jesus is doing is acknowledging kind of the brokenness that we live in already. But then, he says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. And I got curious this week, and went and looked at the Greek words that sit underneath this story. And I can search in a tool I got in Greek and in English. So I searched in English for die, because when we say pass away, that's what we mean, right? That's a different Greek word. The Greek word pass away that is used here has more of a sense of moving beyond. And so if Jesus, there's a couple of times where it's used where he's going towards a town and he moves beyond that town. And that's the word that is used, right? We wouldn't say he passed away the town, right? We would say moves beyond. And so what Jesus is saying is we will not move, this generation will not move beyond before all these things have happened. Which is an acknowledgement that they have suffered with all of the pain and struggle and violence that they have. And then to say that heaven and earth will not pass away, I don't think it's about death. What I think Jesus is saying is heaven and earth are not going to move beyond, right? Or they will move beyond, but they're going to move beyond toward the thing that doesn't move beyond, which is his words. And Jesus is the word. So what I think Jesus is saying is he knows that he's going to die and be raised into this place of new life, and there he is going to gather up all of it. Gather up all of creation and bring creation back into this wonderful relationship with God, so that yes, heaven may pass beyond where it is, and earth may pass beyond where it is, but where they are going is into this unity that Jesus brings, bringing God back into a great place with all of creation. And if that's the case, then that can happen today. Because even though we live in that place where there is terrible stuff going on and violence and disasters, we are also people that live after Easter, which is the point that Jesus went to the cross and came out with the resurrection to bring all of that stuff together. So while Jesus does not pass beyond us, he already has brought beyond the place where heaven and earth come together and the wonders and glory of God are starting to come alive. And if we hear this story then with that understanding, it's a whole different thing. When Jesus says all of the bad stuff is going to happen, we say, yes, we're aware of that. And then he says, but I am not going to move beyond. I've already gathered up all of everything. So now, be aware and keep alert. Does that mean be aware and keep alert because we don't know when it's going to happen? Maybe. But what if it's an invitation to just being present in the day? If we don't have to worry about later, if Jesus already has us, if he's already gathered up heaven and earth together and brought us into the unity of God's love and wonder, if that's already done, we're not looking for some ominous thing in the future. We're looking right now, which means being present to the moment and present to what is right in front of us. And if we are present to what is right in front of us, we may just find that all of these things have not passed away before our generation, right? We may see God at work, and our expectations of seeing God may be fulfilled in ways beyond what we can imagine. And this doesn't have to be amazing, fantastical stuff. I used to travel all the time for my job, and I spent way more time in the airports in Atlanta and Memphis than I would have cared to in my life. And usually my trip through the Memphis airport was get off my plane, maybe catch something to eat on the way by the food thing on the way to the next plane that I had to get on rather quickly. One week, after a very long week, I was dragging through the airports. I had a long layover. There wasn't really anyone else there, and made my way up to the gate counter, and that was back when you still had to get your boarding pass printed out at the airport. And I handed the lady all of my stuff, and clicked on her keyboard like they do, and then printed out my new boarding pass and handed it to me, and I looked at it, and it said 1C, which is a first-class seat that I did not have. So I said to her, I think this is a mistake. And I wanted to hand it back to her. And she said, no, it looks like you've had a rough week. Why don't you just enjoy that seat and get home safe? That was an amazing gift of grace for me that day, because if you've been on an airplane, you know the seats aren't human-sized seats. But the first-class seats are, right? You can get in, wiggle around a little bit, you can stretch your legs out, they bring you drinks and all kinds of stuff. And on that day, where I was just at the end of just a really long stretch, more exhausted than I'd been in a long time, she saw that. Why did she see that? Because she was present to what was right in front of her. She wasn't thinking about getting off at the end of her shift. She wasn't worried about making dinner. She might have been, but with all the rest of that, she was still able to see a human being in front of her and respond to that human being with some grace and mercy that just had a wonderful impact on me getting home that day. That, I think, is what Jesus is inviting us to do when he says, keep awake. And sometimes it is life or death stuff, right? Sometimes I'm at the airport, but other times it is life or death. The teen suicide rates in Colorado, when I was out there for internship in Denver, are super high. And there had been, a few years before we got there, a congregation that sat right down a little bitty hill from a high school. And the high school had 3 suicides, I think, in 1 week. And the congregation was paying attention. They were present to what was going on around them. And they said, you know what? We have to do something about this. So they started a foundation called the Second Wind Fund that works to prevent teen suicide. And they do amazing, amazing work. More than a decade in, the number of lives they have touched is beyond what you could imagine, and probably beyond what they could have imagined or expected when they got started. But it's all because they were just present with what was in front of them, trusting that God creates things new, and they went into that space, and that's what happened. When I was a chaplain, we have to serve when we get trained as pastors as a chaplain at the hospital. I was at Children's Hospital in Columbus, Ohio. I had other colleagues in other hospitals in the area, and some of them, I think during their training, were taught that you can read the chart of the patient to get a sense of what's going on, because before you go in, you might want to know if they just had brain surgery or they just got diagnosed with cancer or whatever it might be. That's not what our supervisor told us to do. She said, you don't need to read the chart. If you go into that room and just be present, what will happen, or what needs to happen, will happen. If the people need to talk about death, they'll talk about death. If they need comfort, you'll bring them comfort. If they need to be distracted and just, get their minds on something else, you'll have that kind of conversation with them. She said, you don't need to know. You don't have to read all of that. But how often do we as people get so focused on gathering information and looking off into the future and worrying about the past that we lose sight of what is right in front of us? And what is right in front of us sometimes is not great, but often it is the gift of life that we have been given that's hidden within all that is there. So when I hear this story in this season of Advent about expectation and waiting, I really do hear a positive message from Jesus that says, hey, yes, there's terrible stuff in the world, and before all that suffering's done, right, it's probably going to get worse. But even as it gets worse, Jesus is going to show up and gather us in, because that's what he has promised to do. And what does that look like? Well, the season of Advent is about setting expectations for that. And my guess is that we have all sorts of expectations of that are way, way, way small. Just like when I went to that museum and turned a corner and saw that submarine, and what did I say? Wow! That's what I expect is going to happen as we encounter Jesus. And that's not just later, right? It's in the day today. As we are present in the day, we will find Jesus showing up in ways that make us go, wow, and then share that story with others that touches their lives as we go. Amen.
Amen.